Hello everybody, this is going to be a quick video over Milgram's work, obedience, reasons we obey, and some of the moderators of obedience. So let me pull up my visual aid, maybe it'll help folks follow along a little bit better. All right, here we go. So first, who is Stanley Milgram? Stanley Milgram was a scientist back in the 40s and obviously other decades. But Milgram was doing his work at a time when the Holocaust was a very prominent thing in people's minds. The audacity, the terrible nature of the event was so profound that a lot of people, and that I'm sure that wasn't the only reason why people did this, but a lot of people, especially in the States, assumed that the reason the Germans did it, performed the Holocaust, is because Germans were just evil people. All right, that was the belief of many Americans at the time. In fact, Milgram even, I don't know to what extent he subscribed to this idea, but he certainly believed that Americans would never commit such an act, such as the Holocaust. All right, conveniently ignoring the genocide that we had committed on the Native Americans, and that we, at the time, well, not at the time of the study, but during World War II, had Japanese in functionally concentration camps. Besides that, Milgram was certain that Americans would never obey someone to the point of killing them. All right, so they would never ultimately commit a crime as heinous as the Holocaust. And so he set out to demonstrate that, yes, Americans would not do such an evil deed. And so what he did, is that he recruited participants from newspaper listings, and he just recruited participants to participate in a learning experiment. Specifically, he told participants that he was looking at the role of punishment in learning. And so what he would do is he would have two people come in at a time. Now, what he didn't tell the participant is that one of the two, was actually a Confederate, a person working for him, the researcher. And but this Confederate acted like a participant, and so they're told, hey, we're looking at the effect of punishment on learning, and we're going to randomly assign one of you to be the teacher and one of you to be the learner. The randomly assigning was made up, all right. They rigged it such that, and I believe they used pieces of paper and a hat, and each of them, the real participant and the Confederate posing as a participant, both pulled out a piece of paper, but both pieces of paper said teacher. And so when the Confederates read their piece of paper, they just said, well, mine says learner. Then the learner was taken to another room, hooked up to a set of wires, and set behind a window facing so that the real participant could see them. Now, at some point prior to them leaving, the Confederate had mentioned that they had a heart condition, just in passing, all right? So that every participant had this in the back of their mind, that the Confederate, the other participant, had heart issue. Then the teacher, the real participant, was given a list of word pairs. So like they would pair words like flower, orange, pen, shelf. So the word pairs were largely irrelevant, but the idea was that the participant, the teacher, would read this list of word pairs off to the learner, and then after that teaching phase, the Confederate, the learner, would be tested such that the teacher, the real participant, would give the first word in each of the word pairs, and the learner, the Confederate, would have to give the other word pair. Okay, and the rules were that for each incorrect answer, the participant had to administer a shock to the Confederate, to the other person that the real participant thought was just a regular guy off the street. Now, each wrong answer, for each wrong answer, the participant had to increase the voltage, all right, such that the voltage, as it increased, eventually got to a point that it was lethal, all right. Now, at any point, if the participant became concerned or asked what they should do or asked for clarification, the experimenter had a script that basically led them to say, it is important for you to continue with the experiment. Also, the experimenter would take responsibility. So, if participants asked, became hesitant to continue, the experimenter would say, I will take responsibility for anything that happens. Now, as the experiment goes on, and as the voltage gets higher and higher, the Confederate had a script for how to respond. Obviously, when he got shocked, he would act like it hurt. And there was no real voltage being sent to the Confederate. He was playing. And then, at a certain point in the script, he would start asking to stop. At that point, the experimenter would simply say, it's important for you to continue the experiment. And they would go on. The experimenter would say that if the participant asked. Then at a later point, the Confederate appears to pass out. If the participant asked the researcher what to do, in this instance, the researchers told the participants to treat non-answers, such as those not given by a person who's apparently passed out, to treat non-answers as wrong answers, and to continue going up in voltage. All right. Now, that seems pretty audacious. That seems pretty like, who would do that? And certainly, like I mentioned, Milgram thought nobody would go all the way. All right. No, he thought that no American would proceed past lethal voltages. And yet, 60% of the participants did. 60%. Now, that was certainly astounding, and they replicated it in various forms over time and found when are people more or less likely to obey, and we'll talk about some of that later. But one of the crucial things here is, why did they obey? Right? Because again, Milgram was dumbfounded. Milgram thought Americans would never do that, right? And yet, 60% of his sample were willing to continue administering shocks for an experiment that there was almost no consequence for quitting. All right? Nobody was looking over them with a gun. Nobody had a gun to their head. Nobody was forcing them to. At any point, they could leave. And yet, 60% continued to the point of administering what they believed to be a lethal shock. All right? So why did they do this? Well, over time, a lot of researchers tried to identify reasons for this. And here are several of the reasons why people continue to obey. One, identifying with the cause of the authority. So if, in this example, if participants really thought, research on learning is highly important, then they're identifying with the cause, right? And so that might lead them to be more inclined to obey. When they don't when they don't feel responsible for their actions. Remember that in Milgram's study, one of the script elements was that the experimenter said that they would take responsibility. All right. So when people don't feel responsible for their actions, they're more willing to obey. Another reason is gradual escalation of the orders, right? So remember that the voltage switches were and I don't guess I mentioned this, the voltage, the intervals of increase in voltage between each switch is very small, all right? And so when you shock them with 90 volts, and then you're asked to shock them with 95 volts, that's not a huge difference. It's only a 5 voltage difference. And so it leads people to feel inconsistent. Not agreeing to 95 volts seems inconsistent with agreeing to 90 volts. And so it takes advantage of some of those dissonance reduction mechanisms. Again, go back to my video about cognitive dissonance, we don't like to feel inconsistent. And so when we feel inconsistent, we try to change things to behave in a consistent way. And so in this situation, saying no to administering 95 volts feels inconsistent with saying yes to 90 volts. That difference is too small. Now, had the differences been bigger, right? So had it been a jump from 50 to 100, right? That jump might have been too big. It might have been easy to externally justify, well, no, that's too big of a jump. I'm not going to do that. Saying no to 100 is very much, saying no to 100 volts is not inconsistent with saying yes to 50, all right? But the increments were very small, and so it took advantage of those, those small increments took advantage of the consistency motives that we have. Uncertainty, all right? In this situation, people are very, very uncertain, right? They're seeing somebody hurt. They're being told that it's important that they continue. They're being told to treat the hurt person in a certain way. So they're getting all this conflicting information. And it also may have been a somewhat fast-paced situation, right? And so all this combines to make the person very uncertain. And if you go back and look at my video on informational social influence, you'll note that one of the things that lead people to conform more when uncertain is the presence of experts. A researcher is an expert. And indeed, what we'll see a little bit later is that presence of status or status cues tends to be a moderator of whether people obey. So when we're uncertain, we look for information about what to do, and when an expert is present, we look to them. In this situation, in the situation of Milgram's research, an expert was present, the researcher. Another thing is we want to belong. And once we've established a norm of obeying, and also the Confederate going along with the whole thing also seems to establish this norm of obeying, violating that norm might cause rejection. And so that desire to belong to a group may lead us to continue to obey. So these are some of the reasons. So normative social influence and informational social influence, the mechanisms behind them, the motives, uncertainty and belonging, may also play a role in obedience. And so these are some of the reasons why over the years people have argued that people obey in situations like Milgram's research. But what are some of the moderators, right? So what are some of the things that increase or decrease obedience? So when do people obey less? Well, when they're reminded of their personal responsibility. So remember, one of the reasons earlier that we talked about that people obey is that they don't feel responsible. Reminding people of their responsibility makes them less likely to obey. Proximity to the victim. So if they're being given a command to hurt someone, the closer they are to the victim makes them less likely to obey. So for example, you know, if you put people in a chain, right? So there's a command that would hurt someone, a middleman, and a person executing the command. The middlemen are far more likely to obey than the people executing the command, right? Because the people executing the command are closer to the victim, right? So proximity to the victim reduces obedience. Presence of signs of authority. So like we mentioned earlier, right? They did variations of Milgram's study in which they manipulated the presence of status symbols like a lab coat or a clipboard, all right? In the absence of those symbols, people obeyed less. And then when motives of the authority are questioned, right? So when people are made to think or question why the authority would be doing this, and you can kind of think of this as the opposite of identifying with the motives of the authority. When people are made to question those motives, it makes them less likely to obey. Now, I'll end this video with the question of, well, do we still do it? Because certainly, you know, when we read about and we hear about Milgram's study, it seems like that was so atrocious. I mean, it's incredible, and most of us succumb to the not me fallacy, meaning most of us would say, I would never do that, right? Well, do people still do it? Yes. Yeah, they still do. Maybe a little bit less, but not significantly less. So Berger, in an article that he published in 2009, reports a study where he replicated Milgram's study as close as possible, given ethics. All right, because Milgram's study, obviously, for a number of reasons, was very unethical. So far as I know, he never debriefed them. You know, he never had it approved by an institutional review board, as all human research has to be done today. And so all of the flags that we see today went unseen then. And so Berger replicated as close as he could, and they identified through a series of analyses, identified that in the original work, that if people agreed to administer a shock of 150 volts, they were more than likely going to continue all the way to the end. All right? And so what Berger did is he just went to 150 volts, see if they agreed to do it, and then stop them. If they agreed, then that was their top end. If they didn't, then that obviously they didn't go all the way to the end. In the original study, something like 80-some-odd% of participants continued all the way to the end once they hit 150 volts and agreed to it. In Berger's research, about 70% agreed to 150 volts. So yeah, a small decline there, all right, but not a big one. So do we still obey? Yeah. All right, guys, that's it for this video over obedience, the reasons for it, and its moderators. As always, if you have any questions, send them my way. If not, have a great week, and I'll see you later on.